it was very intense. Different parties and different individuals having different ideas, and just very stressful around the time you got to that midpoint in June 93.
Today, we're going to be speaking to Suzy Byrne, who's been involved in the gay rights movement for many years. She's worn many different hats, and she was a key member of the decriminalisation campaign in the early 90s. So thanks so much for joining us today, Suzy. So tell us, how were you involved in the early gay rights movement?
I suppose early has different stages. So I suppose
you can go from the beginning, don't worry.
I don't go back to 1970 or 71, so I'm talking, my involvement was really from 1991 onwards. And I was involved with what was called the Dublin Gay Youth Group at the time, but also involved in Gay Community News. I was one of the staff there on the Community Employment Scheme. I was news editor. And I also then joined GLEN, the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network. And I became one of the co-chairs of GLEN. I was asked to join as a co-chair of GLEN during the campaign, the latter stages of the campaign for decriminalisation of homosexuality. And also then I went on to work on the campaign for equality, representing GLEN on that. And GLEN would have been one of the groups that really led that campaign for anti-discrimination legislation. I was also chairperson of the International Lesbian and Gay Youth Organisation, which is a international NGO that represents LGBTQ youth and student groups around the world. And I would have worked for them really for 3 years, mainly in Europe, organising seminars, conferences and political representation for LGBT youth. So that was in the mid-90s. So it was very active really from 91 till 1997.
Wow, you seem to have worn a lot of hats in those early days, my goodness. Can you tell us about working with GCN?
GCN was the only outlet. We were talking about pre-internet days. So it was the only outlet for many people to get news about lesbian, gay issues at the time. You didn't have, at that stage when I joined, you didn't have people who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender writing in mainstream press about issues. The coverage of gay issues in the mainstream would have been very focused on sort of hidden stories of people talking about coming out, maybe about some gay pop star or story in a soap opera or something like that. And then I suppose issues around HIV and AIDS were very much to the fore at that time. So GCN, which had been going for a number of years at that stage, was the only outlet, particularly for people who weren't living in cities. It was really important. And so there were a group of people working to produce the paper once a month. I was very involved in politics. I had a background. I worked in the Mary Robinson campaign in 1990, and I worked in other youth politics campaigns. So I had a real interest in news and politics. And I had no journalism training. I just, learned my skills in GCN, learned how to use a computer. It was really important because I'm disabled and I had huge difficulty in expressing myself using pen and paper. So I was trained in desktop publishing a little bit. I wasn't very good at it, but anyway, there were other people much better than me at that. And just finding stories and publishing stories. And because I was involved with GLEN, I suppose I also then had an insight or an inroad into the latest things that were happening, be it around decriminalisation or other things that were happening around trade unions, workers' rights, student rights campaigns, to support LGBT students in colleges. Issues to do with religion and the church, which were very dominant at the time because they were the main opposition. Issues where people might have been discriminated against on the basis of their sexuality, and if people were brave enough to come forward to talk about that. So those are the sort of stories that I covered. It was a very happy band of people, really. I mean, we were living in, lots of us were, I was living in a bedsit, had very little money. Most of the people had very limited means that were working in GCN. You were begging for people to advertise in the paper. FÁS were funding it at the time, which was the state employment support agency. They were paying us to work on it, a scheme for people who were long-term unemployed or who had a disability. That was, with what was behind GCN at the time. And we were the avenue for people in the community to link in and find out what was going on. It's also personal ads. That was an important way for people to contact and find other gay people, and then also providing information, very important. GCN was really important for providing information and on, your health, mental health issues.
From all that, that's so interesting. Thanks so much for sharing. You then became involved in the decriminalisation campaign. How did that start, and what was it like being involved in that campaign?
Well, one day, I think I was ranting in GCN offices, and that's where GLEN held their meetings, in the Hirschfield Centre. I was ranting so much that the editor of GCN at the time sat me down at a GLEN meeting and said, go there, do something there at it. So I joined, and it was really interesting. I got to meet Kieran Rose, Chris Robson and others who've been working on these issues for quite some time. We were also on an opportunity where there was a government elected where there was a possibility of decriminalisation taking place. The Labour Party had committed to it. There were some people in Fianna Fáil who were, supportive. And I suppose it was just a great opportunity at the time to become involved. There was one stage we were considering running candidates for election, because there was a key election in 92 where we decided that we wouldn't run, because previously to that there had been gay candidates running elections, I think, in 1989. But we decided in 92 not to run candidates, but more to get political parties to put decriminalisation on their agenda. And from that, it was when the governments were formed and working, then I would be part of the delegations that have gone to meet with TDs and ministers, and also with other groupings, with trade unions groupings, student groupings and other organisations, to basically lobby for the agenda, which was to see full equality, because there were lots of different stages around that time of 92 and 93 where the proposals were being brought forward, where it was considered to bring in a different age of consent, because that's what they had done in the UK, for example. But also then, we didn't want to be treated differently, want to be treated the same as everyone else. There was also, I suppose, lots of TV stuff and media stuff. So I would have participated in debates that took place at the time. I suppose you put a reeling in the years together of all the clips of different things. There were lots of us who were attending late shows, prime times. Joe Maxey, I think, we myself and my friend Junior Larkin, we would have appeared on programs to argue, along with other young lesbian gay people, to argue for decriminalisation. And I suppose it was important for me. People wonder why I was, as a lesbian, was so invested in the issue. I mean, I'm a human rights activist, always have been. I believe in equality. It doesn't necessarily have to be about myself, but also it did have an impact on lesbian women. We were quite invisible. There were lots of women involved in women's movements and violence against women initiatives and other campaigns. But a lot of lesbian women were in a position where they had children and they were afraid of losing their children if they became publicly identified as lesbian, and there were, women were in a very difficult situation to come forward. And we're also affected by the decriminalisation campaign, if not directly in the law, but by association. And I suppose the wider campaign of seeking equality in the workplace, equality in reception of goods and services and things like that, they were all linked. So for me, it was an important issue to be involved with. And I was very lucky. I mean, I learned an awful lot from being in that campaign. It's probably one of the things I'm most proud of, to have been involved, and something that, I'll never forget the involvement I had at the time. It was very intense, different parties and different individuals having different ideas, and just very stressful around the time you got to that midpoint in June 93 to see the legislation introduced, to be in the Dáil at that time when it was happening. And to see, because it opened doors. Of course, the level of prosecutions of gay people for sexual activity was very low, but it actually was so linked to whether we could talk about LGBT issues in education, whether you would see health services improve. All of those things were linked to that issue of decriminalisation. So that's why it was so important.
There's a great clip of you, Kieran Rose and Phil Moore, I think, outside Leinster House. You're toasting champagne. What was it like at that moment when it went through? How did you feel? What was the emotion. Tell us about that.
There was a filibuster of sorts that took place that day, in that we were hoping that there wouldn't be a vote on the issue, but there were some people in opposition who wanted to speak. And so it'd been quite stressful watching the debate. And I suppose when that photo took place, it was just a moment of great relief. It was very cheap, bubbly. And we had pink carnations, and I was wearing a jumper for which I get slagged about continually to this day. So I'm not a fashion guru, and that not much has changed in that line either. But yeah, so there's lots of slagging about that. But it was a great photo. It appeared on the front of the Irish Times. We made postcards out of it, and it was great. But the better times was the Pride March that happened a few days after that.
Okay.
That was fabulous. Wow. That was, there was the steps of the central bank. The Dice Man was dressed with the ball and chain being Junior was in a wedding dress as a pregnant bride, giving birth to a new life and things like that, So it was, that was brilliant. That Pride March was great, because we marched up past the Dáil, and it was, what do we want? Equality. When did we get it? Yesterday type of answer to the chant, So those days they were great days. So.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much, Suzy. And thank you so much for all your involvement over the years and continuing to fight and be active. And it's much appreciated. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Donald.